I skipped rent that month so she could shine. That's not an exaggeration. There's a notice still pinned to the back of my kitchen door, reminding me how much I risked for someone who couldn't even look at me when it mattered. The gown she wanted wasn't just expensive, it was custom. Silk, hand-stitched, fitted to her every curve. I remember the way her eyes lit up when she tried it on. She twirled in the mirror and said, "This is it. This is the one that will make them remember me," and I believed her. I believed in her. I always had. So I told my landlord I'd be late, sold a few things I shouldn't have, and handed her the envelope with the deposit, even though my fridge was almost empty. She cried when she opened it, hugged me so tightly I thought maybe, just maybe, I wasn't being foolish. But now, I wonder if she cried because she knew what she was taking from me, or if it was just another performance. The night of the ceremony, I sat in the 5th row, wearing the same black dress I've owned for years. I had curled her hair that morning, packed snacks for her bag, and made sure she had tissues just in case her makeup ran. I didn't care that no one knew who I was. I didn't need the spotlight. I just wanted to see her proud. And when they called her name, she floated on stage, radiant. They handed her the plaque. She smiled at the crowd, thanked her teachers, her stylist, her dog. And then she said, "I did this on my own." She didn't even glance in my direction, not once. Not even by accident. The applause was thunderous, like a wave I couldn't outrun. Everyone stood, clapping, some even wiping away tears. I clapped too, out of habit, maybe. My palms stung, not from the sound but from the ache in my chest. I was trying so hard to swallow. I smiled for her. I even took pictures. But every time I looked at the screen, the woman in the frame felt like a stranger. Not because she'd changed, but because I suddenly realized how invisible I'd always been to her when the lights were on. Backstage, after the ceremony, she was surrounded, friends, classmates, a local blogger with a microphone. She laughed and posed and leaned into every hug. I waited by the exit like I always did, quiet, reliable, steady. She finally spotted me and waved, her smile tightening. "There you are," she said. No, thank you. No acknowledgement. Just there you are. Like I'd wandered in late instead of holding her world together all week. She didn't ask if I was okay. Didn't notice the circles under my eyes. Didn't ask if I had eaten. Instead, she said, "Let's take a selfie before we lose the lighting." So I stood beside her, our heads pressed together, and I forced a grin while she posted it instantly with the caption, "Dreams come true when you believe in yourself." No tag, no mention, just her, just the dress, just the fantasy. And in that moment, I knew I wasn't part of the dream. I was the part she edited out to make it cleaner, shinier, more inspiring. Because no one claps for the one who pays the price. They only cheer for the one who wears the gown on the drive home. I didn't turn on the radio. I let the silence press in, heavy and echoing. The streetlights passed in blinks, casting shadows across the dashboard, and every mile felt like peeling something off my chest. I wanted to cry. Not just for what she didn't say, but for what I had let myself believe, that love, that friendship, that showing up and giving without question would one day be seen. But maybe I was never supposed to be seen. Maybe I was always the stagehand, never the cast. I replayed her speech in my head, the way she stood tall, glowing, her voice steady and proud. I did this on my own. That sentence kept scratching at me like a stone in my shoe. I didn't want applause. I didn't want a thank you in front of everyone, but I did want something, a glance, a nod. A private message later that said, "I saw you, I remember," but my phone stayed quiet, and so did she. I walked up the stairs to my apartment building and passed the envelope tucked into my door. Frame, notice. Rent overdue, final warning. I stood there, holding it in one hand and my phone in the other. She was still online, still liking comments that called her an inspiration. And I was the girl in the 5th row with borrowed heels and an empty fridge. Wondering how belief in someone else could make you feel so small? I had skipped rent so she could wear a dream, but tonight I wore the truth, and it fit just a little too tightly around the ribs. The next morning I told myself it wasn't a big deal, that maybe she just got overwhelmed, that public speaking makes people forget things, that she was nervous, distracted, caught in the moment. I poured stale cereal into a chipped bowl and stared at the final warning notice on the counter. The milk was expired. I drank the cereal dry. I checked my phone again. No messages, no voice note. No, I saw you in the crowd. She posted another picture, her onstage captioned, "Self-made." No shortcuts and still nothing. No trace of me. It was like I hadn't even been there, like I was a ghost holding up her spotlight, fading out as soon as it landed. I stared at the photo until it blurred. I wanted to text her, to say, "Hey, that really hurt." Or, I skipped rent so you could feel beautiful. Or even just, did you forget I exist? But I didn't, because somewhere inside I already knew her response. She'd say I was being sensitive, that I made this all about me. She'd remind me she never asked for the dress, that she didn't tell me to miss rent. And she'd be right, because technically, she never asked, she just expected. And I kept showing up. Not because she demanded it, but because I thought that's what love was. I didn't realize until that moment how often I had built entire bridges with no one waiting on the other side, and how long I stood on them hoping that this time she'd walk toward me. 2. I started thinking back not just to the gown, but to everything before it, all the birthdays I organized, the photos I took but was never in, the rides I gave, the calls I answered at midnight, the times I rearranged my life to fit her schedule, to catch her tears, to carry her stories. I used to call it loyalty. I used to feel proud that she came to me when no one else could handle her. But now I wondered if she ever saw it that whiff. I was her anchor or just her convenience. When things were good, she vanished. When things fell apart, she appeared, needing, asking, expecting, and I gave every time, but not once could. I recall a moment where she offered that same weight back to me. Not once did I cry and find her waiting. Not once did I fall and feel her hands underneath me. She was light in the room when it shined on her, but when I dimmed, she disappeared. It's a strange kind of heartbreak, the one that comes not from a fight or betrayal, but from realizing you were always the side note in someone else's headline. And the hardest part wasn't even the forgetting, it was that she didn't seem to notice she'd done it. Because to her, I was just the girl who always showed up no matter what, no matter how little she looked back. And I don't think it ever crossed her mind that one day I might stop, that one day I'd stop bending, and she'd finally see what it felt like to reach for something that wasn't there. That afternoon, I stood in front of my closet and saw the space where the dress had hung. It was empty now, just a bare hanger swaying slightly as if still remembering her silhouette. I reached up and touched the wood knot for the fabric, not for her, but for me, because that dress had taken up more than space in my apartment. It had taken rent, food, energy, hope, and in return, I received absence, silence, a shadow on stage where my name should have never needed to be said out loud but felt erased all the same. I sat on the floor and let my back rest against the wall. My body was tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. It was the exhaustion of being invisible for too long. I opened my phone and hovered over her name. The message box blinked, empty, waiting like always, but I didn't type anything. Instead, I clicked mute notifications. A small thing, a quiet thing, but it felt seismic, like finally stepping out of a room where you've been whispering to be heard, and realizing you don't have to whisper anymore, you just have to leave. I went into the kitchen and made a sandwich with what I had left, sat on the counter like I used to when I was younger and braver, and I ate slowly, alone but not lonely, because for the first time, the silence wasn't waiting for her to break it. It was waiting for me to fill it with something new, something mine, and maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the end of something. Maybe it was the start of remembering. I was never meant to be background. I took a walk that evening. No destination in mind, just sneakers, keys, and a sweater pulled tight around my ribs. The sky was fading from blue to lavender, and for once, I didn't check my phone. I let the cool air sting my cheeks and reminded myself that breathing doesn't require permission. I passed shop windows filled with mannequins, all dressed for occasions I was never invited to, but I didn't look away. I studied their stillness, their perfect posture, and realized I'd spent so long trying to become a version of myself. She'd applaud. Someone quiet enough not to interrupt, supportive enough to never shine too bright, generous enough to disappear, but I wasn't a mannequin. I had pulse. I had weight. And I was tired of being background to someone else's spotlight. I stepped into a corner cafe and ordered tea. I couldn't quite afford just because I wanted to taste something warm. The woman behind the counter smiled, complimented my scarf, and it startled me how much it mattered to be seen, not for what I gave, not for who I was holding up, but just me. I sat by the window and watched the world go by, the tea warming my hands and something deeper inside me too. I wasn't fixed, I wasn't over it, but I was awake. And that was more than I'd been in months. For the first time, I imagined a version of life where I didn't orbit her needs, where I stopped sacrificing rent and rest and recognition for a girl who never noticed the cost. And in that moment, I realized it's not selfish to stop giving to someone who never asked how much it took. The next morning, I woke up early not because I had to, but because I wanted to see the sunlight come through my window for once. No alarm, no frantic texts, no errands for someone else's big day. Just stillness. I made breakfast slowly, slicing fruit, scrambling eggs, placing everything on a chipped plate like it mattered, and it did, because for the first time in a long time, I was feeding myself without guilt, without rushing off to meet someone else's needs before my own. I looked around my apartment, the same space that once felt like it didn't belong to me, stuffed with her dress, her stress, her name echoing through my every decision. Now it felt quieter, but also cleaner. I picked up the overdue rent notice again. I didn't panic this time. I opened my laptop and started making a list. Places hiring, things I could sell without hurting, services I could offer. For me, not to rescue someone else, but to rebuild something I had ignored for too long. My own stability, because I had learned how to stretch my soul around someone else's dream. Now, I wanted to wrap that effort around myself. Not to prove anything, not for applause, but because I was done being erased. She hadn't messaged. No check-in, no "are you okay?" But I didn't need it anymore. What I needed was what I was already giving myself: care without conditions. Not every wound needs a response to start healing. Sometimes the absence is what confirms the truth. And I was finally brave enough to stop calling silence a misunderstanding. It was a decision, hers. And now, this quiet I was learning to hold, it would be mine. That afternoon, I took the long way home. I passed the boutique where we had picked the dress, the one I still owed half of. I paused across the street, watching through the window as another girl twirled in front of a mirror, her friends clapping, her mother wiping tears. I didn't hate her. I didn't even hate the store. I just felt this aching distance from the version of me that once stood in that exact spot, wide-eyed and full of belief that my sacrifice would mean something. But now I knew better. Not bitter, just better. Not every act of love gets a stage, and not every giver is remembered. But that doesn't make the giving worthless. It makes it sacred. Because I had given without cameras, without hashtags, without anyone clapping. And that's the kind of love that doesn't need an audience to exist. I kept walking. The wind picked up a bit, brushing against my sleeves like a quiet reassurance. "You're still here," it seemed to say, "and you're enough." Not because you gave everything, but because you finally stopped handing it to people who never asked how much it cost. I passed a mirror in a storefront and caught my reflection. No makeup, no filter, just a woman who had lost some illusions, but found something sturdier. Self-respect. I smiled. Small, honest, and in that half smile, I didn't see a girl left behind. I saw someone who had finally decided to arrive for herself. Not to be seen, but to see. And this time I wasn't clapping for anyone. Just walking off the stage I never needed to be on in the first place. A few days later, she finally texted, just 3 words. "You disappeared? Why?" Not "how are you?" Not "thank you." Not even a question about the rent or the dress or the fact that I hadn't shown up to her after party. Just confusion. Like, my silence was more offensive than her erasure. I stared at the message and realized she didn't miss me. She missed the version of me that made her feel supported. The one who showed up without being asked. Who paid without being noticed. She wasn't reaching for me. She was reaching for the utility of me. I didn't respond. Not out of cruelty, but because I didn't want to enter that pattern again. The one where I explain my pain to someone who already proved they don't know how to hold it. Instead, I opened my notes app and wrote something I never intended to send. "I skipped rent to buy you that gown. I stood in the 5th row and watched you thank the world, but not the woman who gave up stability so you could sparkle. You didn't forget me. You erased me." I read it back once, then deleted it because I didn't need her to understand anymore. The closure I was waiting for. It had already happened. It happened when she stood on that stage and looked through me. It happened when I muted her notifications and heard my own voice more clearly. It happened when I sat in that cafe with tea in hand and no one to perform for. She could keep her questions. I had finally stopped needing her answers. And that was more peace than any apology could ever give. I started spending time in places that didn't ask me to shrink. Bookstores, parks, quiet thrift shops where nothing sparkled, but everything held stories. I wasn't trying to fill the space. She left. I was trying to remember who I had been before I wrapped myself around her ambition. It felt strange at first, liberating and lonely at once. Like I had stepped out of a room where I'd been clapping for someone else for years, and suddenly the silence was mine to keep, and in that silence I found small rituals. Lighting a candle before bed, making tea in a mug I never let her use. Reading my old journals, the ones before I met her. My dreams didn't include being someone's shadow. I had stopped posting for a while. Not out of sadness, but because I no longer needed witnesses to prove I was okay. I was learning to believe it without the feedback. To choose softness over performance, to move without explanation, and it hit me one evening, folding laundry in silence that I had always mistaken sacrifice for love. I thought that the more I gave, the more I'd matter. But real love, reciprocal, respectful love, doesn't keep score in silence. It thanks you, it notices. It holds you without needing a spotlight. And the more I gave to myself, the more I realized she didn't fail me because she forgot. She failed me because she never saw giving as something worthy of gratitude, only as her due. And I was no longer offering my worth to be weighed in someone else's spotlight. I was done auditioning for closeness. I was choosing presence my own, and that would always be enough. The last time I saw her photo online, she was tagged in a magazine spread, smiling, flawless, her name printed in bold above the caption, "A woman who made it on her own." I didn't feel anger anymore, distance, like watching a character from a book I used to love, now realizing I was never really written into the story. I closed the app. I didn't need to scroll. I didn't need to read the comments filled with admiration from people who would never know what it cost to make that version of her possible. They saw the gown, they saw the glow, but not the unpaid rent, not the empty fridge, not the girl who held her up and disappeared when the lights came on. And that's okay, because I wasn't in this world to be a footnote in someone else's highlight reel. I was here to write my own pages, quietly, deliberately, with all the care I once poured into her, now folded back into me. I made dinner that night, real food, warm and filling. I lit 2 candles, not because I was expecting anyone, but because I deserved softness, even alone, especially alone. I played music she never liked, danced barefoot in my living room like I used to before she filled the space with her presence. And in that gentle moment, I forgave myself for staying too long, for giving too much, for confusing sacrifice with connection. She may never say thank you, she may never look back, but I will, and when I do, I won't see a girl who was forgotten. I'll see a woman who finally remembered herself, and that kind of memory, it never fades. Weeks later, I found the receipt, crumpled, folded between pages of a notebook I hadn't opened since before the event. It was the one from the boutique, handwritten, the total circled in red, my signature at the bottom. I stared at it for a long time, not with regret, but with clarity. That signature wasn't proof of a purchase. It was a record of belief. A version of me that still thought love would echo back if I shouted it loud enough through acts of devotion. I folded it. Again, but this time with care, and slipped it into a small box I keep for things I don't need anymore but don't want to throw away. Because that moment still mattered. Not for her, but for me. It reminded me who I was, someone who gave fully, without needing an audience. Someone who showed up even when no one noticed. And now, someone who had finally learned to show up. For herself, I lit a candle that night, not out of ceremony, but out of calm. I sat on the floor, journal in my lap, and wrote, "You were never invisible. You were just surrounded by people who refused to look." It didn't sting anymore. Her silence, her caption, the night she didn't look at me from the stage. They weren't chapters I needed to relive. They were just pages I had turned, quietly, completely. And now, I was writing different words, softer ones that didn't require permission or applause. And as I closed the journal and exhaled, I realized the most powerful sentence I had ever learned to say wasn't "I'm sorry" or "I forgive you." It was this: "I'm still here, without you." The next time someone asked me about her just casually, in passing, I didn't flinch. I just said, "We grew apart," and left it at that. No lengthy backstory, no defensiveness, no need to explain all the things I gave that went unnoticed. That's how I knew I had healed, not because the memory vanished, but because it no longer owned the room when it entered. I had made peace with the truth. Some people will love your presence until it stops revolving around them, and when it doesn't, they'll call your boundaries betrayal. But I didn't need to carry that anymore. I had walked through the fire of being forgotten and come out holding the parts of me that refused to burn, and I had rebuilt. Not loudly, not to prove a point, but like planting something after a long drought, patiently. Privately, knowing that not everything worth growing has to be seen to be real, I started doing small things for myself. Buying flowers, turning off my phone without guilt, saying no without apology. And most of all, learning that being the supportive one didn't have to mean being the silent one. I could still love deeply, still care fully, but never again at the cost of my own voice. Never again would I trade rent, food, sleep, or self-respect for a seat in the back row of someone else's story. Because this life mind is no longer a backdrop, it's the whole stage, and I don't need the spotlight. I just need truth. And if that means fewer people in the audience, so be it. At least I know now the one person who will always clap for me is finally standing in the front row. I never told her what it cost me. Not the money, not the skipped meals, not the tears. Behind the applause, maybe one day she'll remember the dress, the drive, the girl in the 5th row wearing worn-out heels and hope. Or maybe she won't, but that's no longer my story to fix. Because the greatest closure I found wasn't in confrontation. It was in release. letting go of the version of me that kept offering everything in hopes of being seen and embracing. The one who now sees herself clearly, fully, quietly. That woman she still gives, still loves, but now she checks the price before paying with her soul. She knows the difference between support and self-abandonment. And when she shows up, it's not to earn a place in someone else's light. It's to stand in her own. There will always be people who rewrite the narrative to center themselves, who wear your sacrifice like decoration and call it destiny, but their silence doesn't define your value, and their stage doesn't own your worth. I gave up rent so she could shine. She didn't even look at me on stage, but I no longer need her gaze to feel seen, because I know now there's nothing embarrassing about giving from the heart. The only tragedy is forgetting to give some of it to yourself. And you? Have you ever given everything in the wings while someone else took the bow? If this story touched something in you, comment. I won't stand backstage anymore.